if you put units fronting directly onto the street, a little bit elevated, not flush, because then you're looking right into people's windows and they shut their blinds, but a little bit of elevation, a little bit of separation to delineate the public space from the semi-public space to the private space through design. This is the key to making walkable streets, the horizontal, the street wall as we call it. Always something artful at eye level. This is the key to our urbanism, the fundamental thing we insist on with all projects. And that's about architecture, right? Because the horizontal is often under the city's control, but the vertical is being built by the private sector. So it's about making sure that you demand that the private sector build a vertical urbanism that contributes to the street. I started to use in our new transportation plan this idea of sticky streets because the point is that streets are places not just to move through, but places to stay in. And our transportation engineers in Vancouver are pretty progressive. They think about people moving rather than cars moving. They think about pedestrians. But they still, before our transportation plan, tended to think about people moving as opposed to people staying and sitting on a patio and enjoying a street, because we weren't thinking about streets as places. Now, in our new transportation plan, we do. There's as much of an appreciation for how people use streets as public spaces as there is around streets as mobility places. So this is an important transition and that it started to really try to beat like a drum out there with other cities. Walk score is a powerful motivator and measurer for walking. I presume does Auckland have walk score? I think it does. Good. Do you know what your Auckland ranking is? Do you know by any chance? I don't. It's not a trick question. When I was in Sydney recently, I pointed out to the Lord Mayor of Sydney that the average walk score for Sydney is 78, which is called somewhat walkable. In Vancouver, it's a walker's paradise. It's something like 85 across the average of the city. And I asked the Lord Mayor in a venue like this, would you put out a welcome sign to your city, welcome to Sydney, somewhat walkable? Or would you demand and expect that you would have a better outcome than that? So the challenge is how you get cities more walkable. And this is an important tool of measurement. It's important to have measurements. And as I talk about Auckland, I'm talking about a lot of your successes, not just on the waterfront, but in Britomart and in your shared streets and such. But I'm also willing to talk about your failures. This was a piece. Is Darren Davis here? Is he somewhere in the audience? He and I wrote, there you are, Darren. He and I wrote a piece for Planetizen about quick wins for Auckland's walkability. And it was based on some of these observations that you clearly are spending some time and money trying to make the driving experience positive in Auckland, but it doesn't necessarily translate to caring about the walker. And I'm being mean, I'm picking bad examples, right? But the point is, when I look in the totality of the experience in the city, I don't see a lot of evidence that you care about walkers. And it shows in where you're putting your money and your attention. But you sure care about drivers, I can tell that. And by the way, this is my favorite example of how not to land a tower. Do you know this project? It's the Alpha. I need to see the Omega. Talk about barricading yourself off to the city. This is a tower that hates the city. You can tell by its design. So this was the piece that we wrote, and I'm still trying. I'm going to try again. I want all of you on Twitter to hashtag Auckland Walkland. I was trying to get that hashtag going the last time I was here. Wasn't quite successful, but I'm not giving up. Cycling is the second, and it's amazing the kind of renaissance that cities around the world are having in terms of urban biking in the last 5 years. I've heard, even in the year and a half I've been working with Auckland, I've heard the growth in the conversation about urban biking. A year and a half ago, there wasn't much conversation. It seems to be picking up speed here. The key to it is to really see urban biking is just an extension of walking. That's how we see it. It's a way to extend your distance so you don't have to, again, choose to ride transit or drive a car. And the critical aspect is going to be separation of infrastructure. You will only get so far with painted lanes. You need to make cycling safe, and not on every street, but on the main high-volume, high-traffic streets. You need to separate. You need to physically separate. That's what Vancouver finally realized a number of years ago, and we've been building separated bike lanes fast since then. But a lot of you folks have just opened your first major separated route. So if you happen to live on one end and work on the other end, you're all set. But what we know is you need a minimum grid. You need a complete network, or else you're not really going to facilitate large numbers of cycling growth. But I still applaud you. It's a good start. You just don't think for a minute you don't have a huge amount of work to do on that. Where we want to be in Vancouver is biking is more than just moving. It's culture, it's texture, it's placemaking. It's part of the identity and character of the city, as it is in cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Utrecht and Stockholm and such. And we're getting there. This was a bike wedding that went by while I was giving a tour of politicians from Amsterdam and Copenhagen, ironically. And they accused me of setting it up, but I didn't. But it shows we're sort of getting there. And by the way, we have bike helmet laws, just like you do. And I'll save that for the Q&A, but don't get me started on bike helmet laws. I don't support them. I support helmets, but I don't support bike helmet law because it's bad policy for cycling safety. That's all I'll say for now. Wow, that's the thing I get applause for. I should get applause for this. What we want is 8 to 80s, seniors and children and women cyclists. And New Zealand has the same problem Canada has, which is that you have a major disparity between women and men cyclists, whereas in places like Europe, it's about 50-50, just like the population is. And I say this is simple to understand. Women are smarter than men. They won't cycle until it's safe, whereas men will put on the lycra and the helmet, and we'll be a mammal, a middle-aged man in lycra, and we'll brave a fundamentally unsafe condition because we're not very smart, but women are. So if we want women to cycle, we make it safe. It's not that hard. If you think that Vancouver is easy, this conversation, this is a magazine that does surveys every year, asks all sorts of odd questions. Best use of taxpayers' money, I don't know if you can see it at the bottom of the screen. The best use of taxpayers' money that year, bike lanes. The worst use of taxpayer money that year, bike lanes. So it's very polarizing. It's an issue in our new municipal election that's about to happen in November. It's an issue in every election. But the city is doing it because it works and because it's right, and it's the correct thing to do. Transit is the third priority. The only thing I want to say about this is respect your buses more. I've heard constantly in narrative that Aucklanders don't like to ride buses. Buses are the heroes of the public transport system, of the mobility agenda in a city. They're cheap, they're nimble, and the idea of integrating something like tram or light rail into the waterfront, it's a lot more expensive, and it doesn't necessarily provide any more rideability, any more mobility in terms of the numbers of riders. So find a way to change the conversation about buses by making bus service more efficient and effective, and the bus riding experience better. It doesn't have to be that people don't like buses, even if it's true. It doesn't have to be that way. And I question whether it's even true. I find when you have a good bus service, people like buses. And when you have a bad bus service, people don't like buses. We use even the water as part of transit. I know you certainly do too. I've had the fun of riding some of your various public transit offerings on the water. All of these are to say that we recognize that mobility is a space problem. Those of you who follow me on Twitter know I like to beat this like a drum. People are sending me comparisons like this from all sorts of different cities because I'm collecting them. And it's powerful in illustrating in pictures the space difference. And this is when cars aren't even moving. And when they're moving, you need much more space in between them. But other cities are having creative ways to illustrate the space issue. You can park a lot more bikes where you park a car. This is London copying Buenos Aires, who probably copied some other city. But now lots of cities are doing this kind of thing to illustrate the space issue. And when we do car share, you folks have car share now. I think you're just starting, is that right, in terms of car share? We have one of the most well-established, ubiquitous car share systems in North America. And what we found when we did the study is every car share space replaces 20 vehicles moving around or parking in the city. So it's a space issue. It gets people from going from a two-car household to a one-car household, or a one-car household to a no-car household, because now that proverbial once-a-month trip to IKEA, you can do it by car share, as opposed to having to own a car and having that expensive thing sitting down in the basement occasionally used. The next aspect of density done well is a consistently high design quality. I won't go into this too much because I did a whole talk on it the last time I was here, and you've got a great champion in Ludo Campbell-Reid and his staff and the growing positioning of urban design within your city making. So I feel I would be preaching to the converted. I would just say that keep going with this in terms of expecting and demanding a high quality. For us, good urban design, again, starts with the idea on the water that the water edge is always public, and even uses like a convention center, which can often try to steal all the public ownership. We forced the province to provide a public edge condition, this kind of environment, wrapping all the way around the convention center. They didn't want to do it. They blamed us for the cost overruns, but they did it, and it's been an absolute success that they now take credit for. But you know, these spaces are only active if they've got something interesting going on in terms of cafes and patios, and it's created some great places. It's also a challenge for public ownership if you've got a working port. I know that's a big conversation, either starter or killer for you in terms of the conversation with the port. We do too. This is Vancouver's working port, but as you can see, it's been positioned as a small component of the waterfront. Many of the port uses have been divested to other port facilities, and now the things that are an advantage to the city happen there, and things that aren't, like offloading cars, for example, get moved to other facilities in the port network. Okay, so you can have a working port, and we actually like that we have a working port, but we don't need to use that working port for everything, which is a conversation you can have with your port. For us, height is also something we're not afraid of. For us, it's just a design challenge. We make sure our towers are separated and thinner than other towers. They have at least 25 meters in between, which provides light access and privacy and views to the mountains and views to the water. We joke that it gives the ability for a naked person in this tower to not be seen well by a person in this tower, which isn't really true because everybody's got binoculars now. But the idea that there is a sense, we've listened to what the public said they wanted and got in the suburbs, like privacy, and we build the concept into high-density living by listening carefully to what suburbanites think they want, and then building something in the inner city that actually outperforms, that does better than the suburbs. Public art and civic art, the integration of beauty and art into things that are functional, like benches and bridges and all sorts of things. This is a major part of our mindset for urban design. Our projects all have courtyards for a sense of respite and relief from the intensity of density, and they're all visible and accessible from the public edge. They're not locked off and cordoned off like some of the waterfront projects I've seen where I've tried to get in them, but I think I would have had to break and enter in order to actually get into some of the courtyards. All of ours are publicly accessible. You can walk right in them, which always is a surprise to visitors who I take on tours. And the last aspect is amenities and diversity that make that high-density living enjoyable, building not only public spaces into your high-density living. Come on. Our beaches certainly are a major part of our public life, but also all the waterfront expressions of public space, all built for, by the way, by developers in our case, where we leverage increases in density bonusing, to pay for the kind of infrastructure and amenities for livability and quality of life that otherwise we would never be able to afford. So all parks and squares and public facilities for public life, all paid for by developers in return, is either as an expectation of development or in return for density. In our placemaking sense, we've really learned a lot by the pilots that we did during the Winter Olympics. I know you had Jeanette Sadiq-Khan from New York here. She talks a lot about pilots and experiments, as do I. We closed a lot of streets during the Winter Olympics. For 17 days, we had to drop the car use by 30% in a city that already had the lowest car use per capita in North America. So we had to close all these streets, partially for Olympic operations, but also partially because of all the urban celebrations we wanted in streets. And the world didn't end. So when we closed a street and the world didn't end, we used that as the basis of a conversation about how that street could transform. And this is now approved in the new transportation plan, the idea of a multimodal causeway through one of our bridges, the Granville Bridge. But we did that because we closed it during the Olympics and the world didn't end.